Marisol Castellano hadn't let herself look at a biker's vest in 4 years. Then a man with no name, no ID, and a fever climbing past 104 was wheeled into her ICU wearing dog tags that weren't his own. Tags with her brother's name stamped into the metal. Marisol worked nights at Ashford County Medical because nights were quieter, and quiet was the only thing that still felt manageable most days. 4 years ago, her brother Danny had ridden home from his second deployment, bought a used Harley with his re-enlistment bonus, and been dead 11 months later, not in a war zone, but on a county road 2 miles from their mother's house, hit by a driver who never saw him until it was already too late. She still remembered the exact color of the sky the afternoon the officer came to their mother's door, a flat, indifferent gray that had never once matched the size of what it was about to announce. She remembered her mother's hands, and her own hands, and how neither pair had known what to do with themselves for the better part of a year afterward. Since then, Marisol didn't look at motorcycles. She crossed streets to avoid parking lots full of them. She'd left her own M's bag from her old combat medic days in a closet she hadn't opened in longer than she could easily count, because some things carried too much weight to keep looking at directly. Her mother had asked her once, gently, whether she'd ever go back to visit the headstone more than twice a year. Marisol had said she would. She mostly hadn't. She was charting at the nurses' station at 11:40 p.m. when the called up about an ICU transfer. Sepsis. Source unclear. Patient unable to provide identification or insurance information. Homeless vet. Looks like. The resident said over the phone. Tired more than anything else. Foot wounds badly infected. Fevers spiking. BP's soft. We need a bed. Marisol had the bed ready in 6 minutes. She always did. It was. She'd come to realize somewhere in the last 4 years. One of the few things that still made complete sense to her. A task with a clear beginning and a clear result. Nothing left over afterward to sit with in the quiet the way grief always did. The man who came up on the gurney was maybe 60. Gray beard matted. Clothes worn thin at the knees. A foot wrapped in a filthy bandage that told its own story before anyone unwrapped it. He was shivering despite the fever. Mumbling something that wasn't quite words. Drifting in and out of a consciousness that sepsis was slowly stealing from him 1 degree at a time. The transport tech who'd wheeled him up barely made eye contact with anyone in the room. Already halfway through paperwork that treated the man on the gurney more like a logistics problem than a person. No known allergies. No known history. No known anything. Really, he said. The particular fatigue of someone who'd stopped expecting these charts to fill in properly a long time ago. Found him behind a gas station off Route 9. Somebody called it in because he wouldn't wake up. Around his neck, tangled with a leather cord and a small metal, hung a set of dog tags. Marisol almost didn't look at them. 4 years of practice had taught her not to look at things like that too closely. But something made her glance anyway. The same reflex that used to make her check a fallen soldier's tags before anything else. And her whole body went still when she read the stamped name. Castellano, D. Her brother's tags. On a stranger's neck. She didn't say anything yet. She couldn't have. Even if she'd wanted to. Her voice had gone somewhere far away. And the part of her that still knew how to function through shock took over instead. Running the admission the way she'd run 100 admissions before this one. Sepsis. Likely from the foot wound, she told the attending. Dr. Okonkwo. Once vitals were in. Fevers 104.2. Pressures 94/60. Heart rates 140. He needs IV antibiotics. Fluids. And probably a surgical debridement consult tonight, not tomorrow. Okonkwo agreed without hesitation. The medicine wasn't the argument here. The argument came 20 minutes later, in the hallway. From a man Marisol had crossed paths with before and never once enjoyed crossing paths with again. I saw the admission note, said Grant Palmer, the hospital's utilization review administrator. Tablet already in hand. No ID, no insurance, no verified next of kin. I need a discharge plan for tomorrow. Not an open-ended ICU stay. Stabilize him tonight. But I'm not signing off on a multi-day admission we have no way of billing. He has sepsis, Marisol said. Sepsis doesn't resolve on an timeline. He needs days of IV antibiotics and monitoring, not a single dose and a shelter referral. I understand that clinically, Palmer said, in the tone of a man who understood nothing of the kind. But this hospital admitted 11 uninsured patients last month with zero recovery on the cost. I can't justify an open-ended admission on a John Doe with no way to verify who he even is. His name is on a set of dog tags around his neck, Marisol said, sharper than she meant it to. Dog tags aren't a government ID, and they're not his, most likely. People find those things, sell them, trade them. Palmer said it the way he said most things about patients like this. A policy position dressed up as a fact. Delivered without once looking directly at the man it was actually about. I'm not being cruel, Ms. Castellano. I'm being the person who has to answer for this hospital's budget when the board asks why we admitted a homeless man for a week over a foot infection. You keep calling him a homeless man like that's a diagnosis, Marisol said. It's not. Sepsis is the diagnosis. Homeless is just the reason nobody caught it sooner. Palmer didn't have an answer for that one right away, and for a moment Marisol thought something might actually be landing. Then he glanced back down at his tablet, and whatever crack had briefly opened closed again just as fast. I'll note your clinical objection in the file, he said. That's the most I can do tonight. Marisol didn't argue further. Arguing with Palmer had never once changed an outcome, and there wasn't time to spend on a fight she wasn't going to win in a hospital hallway at midnight. She went back into the room instead, past a second-year resident murmuring to a colleague in the hallway, probably using again the second he's discharged. These guys always are. A comment made carelessly, not maliciously. The kind of thing said about a stranger that would never once get said about someone whose name you actually knew. Marisol didn't correct him. She filed it away instead. The way she'd learned to file away every small cruelty that added up to something much larger than any single sentence of it. A cleaning tech pushing a cart down the hallway had paused earlier that night too. Just long enough to say to nobody in particular, hope they clean that room extra good after, before moving on. A comment that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the way people decided. Without evidence. What a stranger's life must have been like before the moment they met him. She looked, really looked, for the first time, at the man breathing shallow and fast in that bed. She waited until the room was quiet, until the tech had finished the last set of vitals and stepped out, before she reached for the tags with hands that weren't quite steady. Castellano, D. Blood type O positive. A service number she'd memorized 4 years ago from a folded flag she still couldn't look at directly. Her brother's tags. Not a replica. Not something bought at a surplus store. The genuine article. Worn soft at the edges from years against someone's skin. Where did you get these? She said. Quiet. Not sure the man could even hear her through the fever. His eyes opened halfway. Unfocused. Tracking her face without quite finding it. Danny, he mumbled. Danny gave me these. Told me to give them back. Never got around to it. Marisol's whole chest went tight. You knew Danny Castellano? Owe him my life, the man said. Words slurring. Sepsis and exhaustion dragging him back under before he could say anything more. Owe him everything. She sat there for a full minute after he went quiet again. Tags still resting in her open palm. Feeling something break open in her chest that she'd spent 4 years very carefully keeping closed. She thought about the last time she'd actually held these tags, at the funeral home, in a small plastic bag handed to her mother along with a folded flag and a box of things that had come back from overseas without the person they belonged to. Her mother had kept the flag. Marisol had never known where the tags went after that. Had never once asked. Because asking would have meant admitting she still thought about it every single day instead of just the 2 days a year she let herself visit the grave. She didn't know this man's name. She didn't know how he'd ended up on a county road with no ID and an infection eating through his foot. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever happened to him tonight, She was not going to let Grant Palmer's budget spreadsheet decide it. By 2 a.m., his fever had climbed to 105, and his blood pressure had dropped low enough that Okonkwo ordered a second liter of fluids and called for a repeat lactate. Sepsis is progressing faster than the antibiotics are catching it, Okonkwo said. Quiet urgency replacing the calm authority he'd walked in with 3 hours earlier. If the source is that foot wound and it's not surgically addressed soon, we're looking at septic shock by morning. Surgical consult's been paged twice, Marisol said. No response yet, because utilization review wants confirmation of a payment source before this stay gets extended past tonight, a resident said. Apologetic, holding up her own tablet. Palmer's office is sitting on the transfer paperwork, and the surgeon won't move without a confirmed bed to send him to afterward. This isn't elective, Marisol said. This is a man dying of a treatable infection because somebody's worried about a bill. The resident didn't have anything to say to that, and Marisol didn't blame her for it. She was young enough that the system hadn't yet taught her exactly how much energy it cost to fight it every single time, and old enough to already sense that fighting it might be necessary tonight regardless of the cost. She found Palmer in his office at 2:20 a.m. Tablet glow the only light in the room, and didn't wait to be invited in. He's septic and getting worse, she said. The surgical consult you flagged for review needs to happen tonight. Not after your morning meeting. I flagged it for review because policy requires it for uninsured admissions over a certain projected cost. Palmer said, not looking up. I don't make the policy. Ms. Castellano. I follow it. Then I need you to know exactly what following it costs. Marisol said, this man knew my brother. He's wearing my brother's dog tags around his neck right now. And my brother died 4 years ago, never getting the chance to find out what kind of man he actually became after every uniform came off. I am not going to let a billing policy take this one too. Palmer's expression didn't change immediately. He'd clearly heard some version of an emotional appeal from a family member before, filed it under the category of things that didn't change a spreadsheet, and started composing his next line about policy before Marisol had even finished her sentence. I understand this is personal for you, he started, but personal circumstances can't override. I'm not asking you to override anything. Marisol cut in. I'm asking you to actually look at the person your policy is about to fail, instead of the number attached to his file. Something in her voice must have finally landed, because Palmer looked up from the tablet for the first time since she'd walked in. I didn't know that, he said. About your brother, you didn't ask, Marisol said. Nobody ever does. About a man like him. That's the whole problem. Palmer authorized the surgical consult because Marisol laid out, in flat clinical language, exactly what an unmanaged sepsis case would cost the hospital in liability if it went the way untreated sepsis usually goes. But getting the paperwork moving wasn't the same as buying back the hours already lost. By 3:15 a.m., the patient's mental status had deteriorated further. His breathing gone rapid and shallow. The specific fragile rhythm of a body running out of ways to compensate for an infection it could no longer outrun on its own. We need him in the OR within the hour, the surgeon said. Finally arrived. Scrubbing in already. Sepsis is one thing. Septic shock is a different clock entirely. Marisol didn't leave his side for the next 40 minutes, checking his pressure, adjusting fluids, watching his oxygen saturation the way she used to watch a wounded soldier's numbers in a tent with dirt floors and no time to waste on anything except the next necessary decision. Every alarm that fired sent a fresh spike of old, familiar fear through her chest. The specific dread of watching a number climb toward a threshold that meant the difference between a hard night and a funeral. A second resident, younger than the first, poked his head in to ask if she needed relief. She waved him off without looking up. Stay with me, she told the man in the bed. Voice low. Steady. The same register she'd used 100 times in places whose names she didn't say out loud anymore. You didn't carry those tags this far just to lose it here. His eyes opened once more before they wheeled him toward the OR. Clearer than they'd been all night, finding her face with something that looked almost like recognition. Castellano, he said. Weak, but certain. You've got his eyes. I know, Marisol said. Everybody says that. He talked about you, the man said. Every deployment. His sister, the medic, said you were better at this than he ever was at anything. Marisol didn't trust her voice enough to answer that. She just squeezed his hand once before the doors to the OR swung shut between them, and stood in the hallway feeling, for the first time in 4 years, like some piece of her brother had just been handed back to her in the middle of the worst night of a stranger's life. She sat in the surgical waiting area alone for the full 90 minutes, hands wrapped around a coffee she never drank, watching the clock the way she'd once watched clocks in far worse places, counting minutes that meant nothing until suddenly, all at once, they meant everything. She called her mother once, somewhere around minute 40, unable to hold the news alone any longer. Mama, she said, when the sleepy voice answered. I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen before you say anything. Her mother listened. When Marisol finished, the tags. Earl. The surgery still underway 2 floors up. There was a long silence on the line before her mother spoke again. Voice thick with something that had been building for 4 years and finally found somewhere to go. Danny always said the ones who came back owed something to the ones who didn't make it home clean. Her mother said, I never understood what he meant until just now. I didn't either. Marisol admitted, not until tonight. Bring him to see me, when he's strong enough, her mother said. I want to hear it from somebody who was actually there. I've spent 4 years imagining the worst version of what happened to your brother overseas. I think it's time I heard a version that isn't just the ending. Marisol promised she would, and meant it more fully than she'd meant most promises in longer than she could remember. She sat back down after the call, phone still warm in her hand, and let herself feel, for just a moment, alone in a quiet waiting room, the particular relief of a promise that felt like it might actually get kept this time. The surgery took 90 minutes, debridement, drainage. A wound that had been quietly poisoning him for longer than anyone had noticed until tonight. He came out of the OR alive. Pressure holding. Fever finally beginning to break under a combination of surgery and antibiotics that should have started 6 hours earlier than they had. Marisol sat with him through the rest of that night and most of the next day. Off the clock by the time visiting hours technically started. Unwilling to leave until she knew for certain the worst of it had actually passed. She dozed once in the chair beside his bed, waking with a start every time a monitor changed pitch. The old reflex of a body that had learned a long time ago not to trust silence too completely. His name, they learned once he was lucid enough to give it, was Earl Whitcomb. 2 tours overseas. The same unit as her brother for the second one. Discharged with a spine injury that had cost him steady work. Then a marriage. Then eventually the apartment that had gone with both of those things. He'd been living out of a converted van for the better part of 2 years. Working odd mechanical jobs when his back allowed it. Never quite finding his way back to anything that looked like the life he'd had before. He told the story slowly, in pieces. The way people tell stories they spent years deciding weren't worth telling anyone. A marriage that had survived the deployments, but not the years afterward. When the man who came home wasn't quite the one who'd left. A daughter he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, not out of anger on either side. Just the specific distance that grows between people who've both stopped knowing how to close it. A back injury that had ended one kind of work and never quite let him find another that didn't leave him in agony by the end of a shift. Wasn't any one thing, Earl said, just a lot of small things. One after another, until there wasn't much floor left under me to stand on. Marisol recognized the shape of that kind of unraveling more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't so different from her own 4 years, not homelessness. Not by any measure. But the same slow erosion of things that used to feel solid. One avoided phone call and one skipped cemetery visit at a time. Danny pulled me out of a vehicle that was on fire. Earl told her, voice still rough but steady now. Wasn't supposed to be possible, given the angle we were at. He didn't think twice about it. Gave me these tags a week later, joking that I owed him a debt I'd never be able to repay. so I might as well hang on to proof of it. What was he like? Marisol asked, the question coming out smaller than she meant it to. 4 years of wanting to ask someone this exact thing finally finding an opening. Earl thought about it for a long moment, choosing his words carefully for something that mattered. Funny in a way that snuck up on you. Quiet about the hard stuff. Loud about anything he thought was worth laughing at. Never once let anybody carry something alone if he could help it, didn't matter if it was a stretcher or just a bad week. He talked about your mother's cooking more than he talked about home in general. Said nobody made rice the way she did. Marisol found herself smiling despite everything. The first easy smile she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit. She still makes it every Sunday. Out of habit, I think. Even with half the table empty now. He never mentioned you, Marisol said. Not by name. He wouldn't have. Earl said. Your brother didn't talk about the things he did. Just did them and moved on to whoever needed him next. Marisol had spent 4 years assuming she knew the whole shape of who Danny had been. The parts that fit in a folded flag. A closed casket. A headstone she visited twice a year and tried very hard not to think about the rest of the time. She hadn't expected the shape of him to keep unfolding 4 years later. In a hospital room. Through a stranger who'd carried a piece of him this whole time without ever finding a way to give it back. Why didn't you ever try to find us? She asked. Give the tags back. Like you said you meant to? Earl was quiet for a moment, looking down at his own hands. Weathered and thin in a way that told its own story about the years since his discharge. Because by the time I was in a place stable enough to try. I didn't much like what I'd have had to tell you, he admitted. Didn't want to be the man who showed up on your doorstep looking like this. Carrying the last thing your brother ever gave anybody. Seemed like it would have hurt more than it helped. It wouldn't have, Marisol said. It would have meant I wasn't the only one still carrying him. Earl didn't have an answer for that. But something in his face suggested he understood exactly what she meant anyway. Word travels fast through veteran networks once someone starts making calls, and by the following evening. Earl's hospital room had visitors nobody on the floor had been expecting. 2 men in leather vests. One of them gray-bearded. Moving with the particular careful bearing of men whose bodies had cost them more than they'd expected them to. Sergeant Whitcomb, the oldest of them, said, stopping just inside the doorway, taking in the IV lines and monitors with an expression that suggested he'd seen worse and hoped never to see this particular version of it happen to someone he knew. Heard you finally turned up. Wish it hadn't been like this. Rios, Earl said, managing something close to a smile. Didn't think anyone still remembered my rank. Nobody forgot anything about you. Rios said. Took us 2 years of asking around to find out you were even still alive. Wish you'd let somebody help sooner. Wasn't much left of me worth helping. Most of those 2 years. Earl admitted. Didn't want to be a burden to men who already carried enough. Rios's jaw tightened at that. Frustration at realizing a friend had suffered in silence rather than risk being seen as a weight on anyone else's shoulders. That's not how this works. Earl never was. He looked at Marisol next, studying her for a moment before his expression shifted into something more careful. You're Castellano's sister. I am. He talked about you plenty. Rios said. Guess it runs both directions. People not knowing the whole shape of somebody until it's too late to ask them directly. He paused, studying her a moment longer. For what it's worth, ma'am, Danny's name still comes up at reunions. Guys tell the story about the vehicle fire like it happened last month, not 8 years ago. He's not forgotten, not by us, and not by anybody he ever pulled out of something. I don't think you've been carrying that alone as much as you probably thought you were. He didn't salute her, she wasn't active duty, hadn't been in years, but he extended a hand instead, holding it a beat longer than a simple handshake usually lasted. Thank you for what you did for him. And for staying, when it would have been easier not to. The younger man beside him, quiet until now, finally spoke up. I did a tour with your brother's unit 2 years after Earl's. Never met him personally, but the stories about him were still going around when I got there. Guys who never even met him knew his name. That doesn't happen for everybody. It happened for Danny. Rios agreed. Some people just leave that kind of mark, whether they mean to or not. Marisol didn't trust her voice enough to say much back to that, so she simply nodded, letting the silence hold what words weren't quite managing to. Grant Palmer, passing the room on rounds of his own, paused in the doorway long enough to see the two leather-vested men, the dog tags now resting on the bedside table. In the quiet wait of a moment he clearly hadn't expected his utilization review numbers to ever intersect with. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there a moment, recalculating something behind his eyes, and continued on his rounds without finishing whatever sentence he might have started. He came back 20 minutes later, after the visitors had gone, and found Marisol alone at the nurse's station finishing paperwork. I approved his extended admission through the full antibiotic course, he said. Without preamble. Full course, not the minimum, and I'm not doing it just because the liability math works out this time. No? Marisol asked. I'm going to look at the review flag threshold differently going forward. Palmer said. Not because of tonight specifically. Because tonight made me realize how many other nights like it I've probably signed off on without ever finding out the rest of the story. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was closer to honesty than anything Palmer had offered her in the 2 years she'd known him, and for tonight, that honesty was going to have to be enough. 2 weeks later, the hospital's medical director stopped Marisol in the hallway, a request in hand rather than a reprimand. Palmer told the quality committee about Earl's case, he said. About what almost happened, and what didn't happen because you pushed back. We're putting together a policy for veteran patients without documentation, verification pathways through the VA. Expedited care protocols, that kind of thing. I'd like you on the committee. Nobody else on this staff has your combination of clinical judgment and first-hand understanding of what these patients actually need. Marisol hadn't expected that, and it took her a moment to find an answer. I'm not trying to become the hospital's veteran liaison, she said. I just didn't want Earl to die over a billing code. I know, the director said. That's exactly why I want you on the committee, and not somebody who'd treat it like a title instead of a responsibility. She said yes before she'd fully decided to. The way she'd said yes to most things lately that scared her a little and mattered anyway. Marisol drove to the cemetery 3 days later, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit, and sat on the grass beside her brother's headstone the way she used to sit beside his bed when they were kids and neither of them could sleep. She'd brought the dog tags with her. Earl had insisted she keep them, once he was well enough to insist on anything. Saying he'd carried Danny's memory around long enough and it was time it came home to someone who actually shared his blood. You never told me about him, she said out loud, to a headstone that had never once answered her in 4 years of visits, and didn't answer her now either. I had to find out from a stranger with sepsis what kind of person you actually were overseas. The wind moved through the grass, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower started up. Ordinary sounds for an ordinary afternoon that didn't feel especially ordinary at all. I stopped looking at motorcycles because I couldn't stand what they reminded me of, she said. I think I need to stop doing that now. I think you'd have hated that I did that. She thought about Earl. Discharged 3 days ago now to a transitional veterans housing program that Rios and his club had arranged within 24 hours of hearing his story, a bed, a caseworker, a mailing address. All the small ordinary things a person needs to stop disappearing through the cracks a system like this one had let him fall through for 2 years. She thought about the way he'd hugged her goodbye at the hospital doors, careful of his healing foot, saying he'd finally get to keep the promise he'd made himself years ago about returning what wasn't his to keep. I'm going to visit him, she told the headstone. Not because I have to. Because I want to know the rest of what you were. One story at a time. From anybody who's still willing to tell me. She stayed another 20 minutes before she left. Tags tucked into her jacket pocket instead of a drawer she wouldn't open. And for the first time since the funeral. Driving home didn't feel like driving away from something. It felt, instead, like carrying a little more of him forward than she had that morning, not less grief. Exactly. Just grief with room in it now for something that had turned out to still be alive. Grief has a way of convincing us we already know the whole shape of what we lost. Sometimes the truest parts of someone are still out there, carried quietly by people we've never met, waiting for a reason to finally come home. And sometimes the system that's supposed to catch people has to be pushed hard by someone willing to say a name out loud instead of letting a stranger stay a statistic.